Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming out today to this event. I am part of the OVTAMain Victory Trail Association. It's an organization formed to make sure that we were telling the story of the OVTAMain men. And so what we're going to do is tell you that story today. Now, since the OVTAMain Victory Trail Association got going, the National Park Service has created the OVTAMain Victory National Historic Trail. So where these men marched, where they went, is now a national park. It is a linear 330-mile-long national park. Not very wide, but it's a park that goes all the way from Abingdon, Virginia, to Kings Mountain in South Carolina. Now, when the folks first came to America, they were trying to get some land because only the king and the church could own any land in England. So they came over, and a lot of these folks were Irish and Scottish, and they hated the king anyway. They didn't like him very much. They came over here, and then they longed for most of the land to get claimed up. So a whole lot of folks came up here to the mountains and even over the mountains. And after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, the king didn't want to deal with the white folks on the other side of the mountains. So he drew a line across the top of the mountains and said, all you white folks have to come back over here. Now, all the good Scottish and Irish folks who were already over here and didn't like the king anyway, when the king said to do that, they just went, and they didn't do that. And so we stayed over here. We didn't want to go and do that, because then we'd had to give up our land. Our families and farms are already over here. So we're over here. Well, about 12 years after that, a bunch of folks in America decided they didn't like the king anymore either, and we ought to be independent. And so you might have heard of that shot heard around the world. Now, that would have been a really loud gun, right? But, of course, what they were talking about was the fact that we were one of the first places that was a colony that was subdued by some other country that went, we don't want to be that way anymore. And we were the first place that did that. So that shot heard around the world were all these other colonies. And it was basically like when you were little and you had an older brother or sister and they were going to challenge mom and dad, and you hid behind the wall to see if they were going to get whipped before you also challenged them on that. Yeah, that was, kind of what the rest of the world did. They sat back to see if we were going to be able to pull it off. Well, the early part of the war all took place up in New England. Those first battles at Lexington and Concord, and there were battles up there, and didn't tend to be these huge things, like if we think of thousands and thousands of people. There were some fairly big battles. But those first 3 years of the war took place up in New England. And, occasionally would win, but George Washington was a pretty smart guy. George Washington figured out that as long as he had an army, we had a revolution. If he ever stuck his whole army out there and got whooped, that's it. Revolution's over. So if it looked like he wasn't going to win, they just skedaddled. They got out of there and fought another day. Well, there were a few wins here and there for us. And if you're from up in that New England area, they'll tell you the turning point of the revolution was Saratoga. Nah, that wasn't it. It was down here. But after those first 3 years, the British weren't winning. And it was costing a lot of money because they had a 3,000-mile supply line, to get troops over here and supplies and stuff, because we weren't trying to give them a whole lot, although there were an awful lot of people in America that did support the king still. They did not want to be independent. And so the battles take place, fighting back and forth, things going on. Eventually, the king gets irritated, and he goes, y'all got to come up with another plan. This ain't working. So they thought, well, you know what, let's go down south. And so they developed what they called the Southern Strategy. And this plan was to come down south because there were an awful lot of rich folks down here in the south, had big plantations, and these folks didn't have any reason to want to leave the king. They were filthy rich. I mean, they just had to stand there and somebody put their clothes on for them in the morning. They didn't have to get dressed themselves. Life was pretty good for a lot of these folks. And so they thought, well, we'll go down there and talk to them, and they'll fight with us. Now, during the war, if you were a supporter of the king, you were known as a loyalist or a Tory. We refer to ourselves as patriots or the colonials. And so they said, well, let's go down south. And so the overall commander, a guy by the name of Clinton, he gets his folks together. They get on ships and they start sailing south in 1778 around Christmas time. And the weather's horrible. He loses a bunch of ships and all kinds of supplies and horses and all kinds of things disappear. But eventually they make their way down and they lay siege to Charlestown. You might have heard of it as Charleston. And we had our whole army there in Charlestown. Well, they lay siege and they, bombard the place from their ships, and they land troops and surround the place. And eventually our commander, his name was Lincoln, he has to surrender. And so our whole army in the South is gone. There is no army. So the commander for this area was a Lord Cornwallis, and Cornwallis has two commanders with him. One is named Bannister Tarleton. The other is Ferguson, Patrick Ferguson. Now, these two guys were out recruiting. Now, Tarleton, if you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, the bad guy in The Patriot is based loosely on Tarleton. Tarleton is the kind of guy that, came over and said, would you like to join with us? And if you said no, he burnt your house down and hung you in a tree out in the yard. He was not a nice guy. Ferguson was a little calmer about his recruiting. He was, he tried to kind of kill him with kindness. And there were an awful lot of people still loyal to the king. They didn't feel they had a reason to start another country. And so those folks, those loyalists, were getting recruited. But occasionally what they would run up on are what's known as the militia. Now, back in those days, if you were a male person between the ages of 16 and dead, you were in the militia. And so if anything jumped off, they called out the militia, you grabbed your trusty flintlock, you came running. And that's what they did. They came running. Well, these militia groups would be out wandering here and there, and they'd occasionally run into these British soldiers and fight a little battle. And then usually they would disappear because the British forces were bigger. And, of course, my gun won't hold a bayonet. The British guns had bayonets, which makes that a spear. And when you fire this gun with a rifle barrel, it takes me 45 seconds to a minute to reload. Those British soldiers could reload 3 to 4 times in a minute, plus they had a bayonet. So if I'm trying to load and there's some guy running at me with a spear and fixing to ventilate me, I'm probably going to leave, which is what tends to happen. So they kept running up on these militia groups, and Ferguson, he was getting irritated. He was just annoyed about this. And so he had a little battle, and he captured some guys. And he had one guy that he captured who had a cousin who was a militia leader over on what's now the Tennessee side of the mountains. Of course, that used to still be part of God's country, North Carolina over there, but now it's Tennessee. And so he took that guy that he had captured, and he said, I'm going to let you go, but you got to take a note to your cousin. And he said, yeah, I'll do that. So he gives him the note, and the note gets over here, and it says, if you guys don't cut that out, I'm going to march my army over these mountains, and I'm going to lay waste to your fields with fire and sword and hang your leaders. Oh, whoa. Now, remember, we're good Scottish-Irish people. We don't like the British much anyway. And now they're threatening to come over here and burn down our farms and hang our leaders? I don't think so. So they called out the militia. And everybody got together and they said, okay, guys, what do you want to do? You want to wait over here and see if he shows up? I don't think so, because he'll be too close to our houses. Let's go over and get him. So we said, all right. So we sent word out. Now, we sent word up to Virginia, where there was a guy named Campbell in charge of the Virginia forces. He had quite a lot of men up here, and we said, hey, we need your help. He sent back a note and said, can't do it. I'm protecting lead mines and some salt and other things up here. I can't do it. And so we sent him another note and said, hey, if he beats us, who's going to help you? And he changed his mind. He sent a couple hundred men, and we decided that we would meet on September the 25th, 1780, at a place called Sycamore Shoals. It's now known as Elizabethton, Tennessee. And so more than 1,000 men showed up. Campbell showed up with 200. His cousin Arthur Campbell showed up with a couple hundred more. John Sevier, Isaac Shelby, all these other guys, they all showed up. And eventually we had nearly 1,000 men there at Sycamore Shoals. Now, back in those days, if you'd ever seen 15 people at one time, it probably meant that you had 12 brothers and sisters. Okay? It just weren't big towns for a lot of people. So they get to Sycamore Shoals, and I mean, this would have been Well, some of them even brought their families. They brought animals to slaughter to eat. And so on the morning of September 26th, as everybody was fixing to depart in search of Ferguson and his men, there was a Presbyterian minister, well known in the area. His name was Samuel Doak. And Samuel Doak got up and he gave a kind of a pep rally kind of talk, and then said a prayer and said that we're going to go after him with fire and sword, and what he had threatened us, and with the sword of Gideon and the Lord. And so off we went on that morning in search of Patrick Ferguson.
My name is Thomas Morgan. I had moved my family over the mountain back in '74, and I had joined the militia. I served under Colonel John Sevier, Nola Chucky Jack's what we called him. And I got to tell you, I had rode on many campaigns with this man against the Cherokee, but this was unlike anything any of us had ever experienced, because we knew we was riding against the most powerful army in the world, and we knew our chances were slim. We started riding out from Fort Watauga, driving a few cattle with us for provisions, and it began to rain. We got to the bottom of the mountain, a place that the old people called the resting place. We called it the Shelving Rock, and the rain had increased. Now, there was a young lady by the name of Miss Mary Patton. She had brought us in 500 pounds of some of the finest gunpowder you could ever hope to get. So we put our powder under that rock overhang at night to keep it dry, and the rest of us took our blankets and laid out in the rain. We got up the next morning, and we realized there's no way we're driving this cattle over the mountain. It's going to slow us down. So we slaughtered what we could carry, sent the rest back to the fort with some boys, and we headed straight up the mountain where the trail crossed over, a place called the Yalla Mountain Gap. By the time we got to the top of the mountain, the rain had stopped because it had turned to snow. The snow was shoe-mouth deep. We camped on the other side of Yalla Mountain Gap that night, and it's the most miserable night I can ever remember. The wind was howling, snow blowing. It was just miserable. Got up the next morning, and I remember looking back across the Watauga Valley. I could actually see some smoke from some of the little settlements, and I wondered, will I ever see this again? Will my family even be alive when I get back? Because we knew we was leaving most of them unprotected. We done a little drilling that morning, took a roll call, and two of Colonel Sevier's men were missing, a man by the name of Chambers and one by Crawford. Now, Chambers I knew, Crawford I didn't. I never did trust that man. He was like a chicken-killing dog. He was sneaky. And we figured that these men were still loyal to King George, and we figured that they had deserted to let Ferguson know this over-mountain army was on its way. See, that's what they started calling us, the over-mountain men. A few other names, backwater men, and some I can't mention in front of women. But that's exactly what they done. They headed out to tell Ferguson we was on our way. Now, on the other side of Yalla Mountain, we run into a problem, because there were two trails that went off into the Piedmont, and we knew good and well that if we took one trail, Ferguson might be marching his army up that other trail, and we couldn't stop him. He'd go straight into the settlements. So the commanders got together, and they made a decision. They split our forces, something that's seldom done. Colonel Campbell took all the boys from Virginia, took one trail. Colonel Shelby and Sevier took the rest of us. We took the other trail. We come off the mountain with no sign of Ferguson, come riding into a plantation, a place called Quaker Meadows. It was owned by one of our Patriot leaders, Colonel Charles McDowell. We come riding in there in the pouring rain, and the McDowells were so gracious to us. They let us take the top rail off the fence, build fires, try to dry out, brought in a little corn, tried to feed us the best they could. And as we sat there in the pouring rain that evening, here come a whole group of men riding in from Surrey County, North Carolina. They were being led by Major Winston, and a great big man named Benjamin Cleveland. Now, I'd heard of old Ben Cleveland. That man was notorious for hanging a loyalist. If you was loyal to King George, you run into Ben Cleveland, the last sound you hear would be your neck snap at the end of a rope, because that old man would hang you. I liked him. And our army was growing. As we laid in the pouring rain that night, some scouts came in. They found Ferguson. He was camped a few days' ride from us at a place called Gilberttown. We got up that morning in the pouring rain. I remember looking across the field at a big oak tree. All the colonels had met under that tree. You see, what you got to understand is we was all militia. Every militia had its own colonel. We had more colonels than a ear of corn. But the only colonel we had that wasn't from Carolina was Colonel William Campbell from Virginia. So they had voted to make him the overall commander of our army. We took to the saddle that morning and went thundering across the Catawba River. We was headed straight for him, like a lightning bolt. As we traveled, we were picking up more and more men from Burke County, men from everywhere. We got about a day's ride outside of Gilberttown, and the sky opened up on us. It began to pour down the rain. We squatted under a group of cedar trees praying that the rain would stop, but it never let up. So we pushed on. We got right outside of Gilberttown, and we tied our horses up into the tree lines, and we took our rifles, and we moved in on foot. We went screaming out in that field where old Ferguson was at, and he was gone. There was nothing there but cold campfires. He'd been gone for 2 days. And it had rained so much the ground was like a swamp. Even the best of us scouts couldn't find his trail. One of our commanders, a man by the name of Williams, said, well, Ferguson's headed south. He's headed to that big old British fort in South Carolina, Fort 96. So we turned and we started riding in that direction because we had to catch him. Next night we was camped on the Green River. In the middle of the night, I never heard such a commotion. A man come riding through camp. The boys drug him out of the saddle, going to hang him, thought he was a spy. He said, my name's Colonel Edward Lacey. Take me up to see the commanders. So we drug him up. Sure enough, Colonel Sevier knew him. Colonel Lacey asked him, he said, where you boys going? He said, we're riding toward Fort 96. We got to catch Patrick Ferguson. He said, well, I don't know where you got your intelligence, but you're riding the wrong way. Ferguson ain't headed to 96. He's headed to Charlottetown to get reinforcements. And now we all got scared because we knew good and well if he got reinforcements, none of us would ever cross these mountains again. We had rode straight to our deaths. Now Lacey, he had a few Patriot fighters camped a few miles from us, and he agreed to meet us the next day at a place called the Cowpens. We got up that morning, and we rode 29 miles that day in the pouring rain. We come riding into the Cowpens. Colonel Lacey was there with his men. Now, the Cowpens was owned by a wealthy loyalist. He'd buy up all the cattle in that area and graze them on that good grass, and then he'd pay men to drive them north to Philadelphia and sell them. We come riding in there, and we hadn't had a bite to eat since we left Charles McDowell's place. And I got to tell you, every man that I ever rode with in this militia, none of us were a thief. But I also remember hearing the Reverend Oak say one time, the Lord helps those that help herself. So that's what we did. We helped ourselves that man's beef. We didn't think he'd care too much because we was all starved to death, and every one of us had a rifle. And that was the best meal we'd had in days. And as we sat there that afternoon in the pouring rain, we were trying to rest, but nobody could rest because we knew this was our only chance. We knew we would never have an army like this again. As we sat there that evening, once again the commanders got together. They made a decision. They come walking through our camps that evening, and they started picking out 900 of the best men. And they picked out 900 of the best horses that we hadn't rode into the ground chasing Ferguson. And I'll never forget it. At 9 o'clock at night, we took to the saddle. We rode off in the dark in the pouring rain looking for Ferguson. All night long we rode through the darkness. Couldn't even see the horse in front of you. We wouldn't let up. We crossed the broad river in the middle of the night. It was completely flooded. We put our strongest horses downstream in case anybody washed out of the saddle. There was nothing going to stop us. Now the next morning, we rode up on a little settlement, little house. Had a young man traveling with us, quite a little character he was. His name was Enoch Gilmer. Little Enoch rode up to the commanders. He said, I got an idea. If you let me ride over to that house, I'll find out where Ferguson's at. So we all laid back in the woods. Little Enoch rode across the fields, tied his horse off, walked up on the porch and knocked on the door, and there were 2 women living there. One of them opened the door. Little Enoch looked as tough as he could. He said, I'm looking for Patrick Ferguson. I want to join his army. The lady said, well, I know exactly where he's at because we took him eggs. He's on Kings Mountain. Now, some of the men give Enoch just about enough time. They figure he found out what they needed to know. They busted in that house, grabbed little Enoch, going to hang him as a traitor. And them women commenced to squalling, well, don't hang him, he's just a boy. One of the men spoke up and said, well, not to offend these lovely ladies, let's take this little rascal down the road and hang him. So they drug him out of the house where the women couldn't see him. Commanders called him up, said, Enoch, did you find Ferguson? He said, yeah. He's on Kings Mountain. So now we knew. We knew exactly where he was at. And we was riding harder than we'd ever ridden. Because this threat was going to end. It's going to end today. About lunch, some of the men were getting tired. They wanted to stop and rest. And I could see it like it was yesterday. Old Isaac Shelby come riding right through our lines. He said, rest? I will not rest until I ride through the lines of Cornwallis himself. He fired us up and we kept riding. Now, right before 3 o'clock, by the grace of God, the rain stopped. And we were at the bottom of Kings Mountain. William Campbell and those boys from Virginia, they took the front of that little old mountain. Isaac Shelby and the boys from the Holston settlement, they went around one side. Cleveland, Lacey, other commanders took the back of that little mountain. Colonel Sevier took all us boys from Watauga. We went around this side and we had him. He wasn't going anywhere. We hit that mountain the first time and they drove us back. We hit that mountain the second time. We went just a little further, but once again they pushed us back. But the third time we hit that little mountain, we went almost to the top. As a matter of fact, we was so close on them, some of our boys was fighting with their knives and tomahawks against their bayonets. And there was Ferguson. He was on a big white horse, had his saber in one hand, 2 silver whistles. He was riding back and forward on that little mountain, blowing those whistles, barking out commands to his men. Like I said, we went almost to the top. We was right on them. You know, a lot of us older men remember when the Cherokees would attack the settlements. They'd come screaming out of the woods. It'd make your hair stand up. It'd make your skin crawl. So as we hit that mountain and went to the top the third time, we were screaming our heads off, just like the Cherokee. But not only were we screaming like the Cherokee, we were fighting like the Cherokee, because we had learned well. We was hiding behind the trees and rocks. We'd step out and fire and step back in and reload. I was behind a big white oak tree. Ferguson was riding back and forth. You know, some of his boys seen it. We was overrunning them. They'd try to raise a white flag. He'd ride by and just cut it down. You know, to this day, I can't tell you if he's trying to escape. I can't tell you if he's trying to rally his men. But what I can tell you for a fact is he got too far on the south side of that little mountain that day. He ran smack into John Sevier and us boys from the Watauga. I was standing behind that big oak tree. Every time I'd stick my head around to shoot, the bark would fly off. I could hear all the lead rifle balls whistling as they come past. The air was completely full of gun smoke. It looked like a fog. You couldn't even see who you was shooting at, but we wouldn't let up shooting. There was a young man right over from me that day. John Gilliland was his name. Little old John had been wounded 3 times, and he was still at the top of the mountain. I heard John say, "Here comes Ferguson." He raised his rifle, took a real careful aim, and when he pulled the trigger, it went click. It misfired. There was an older gentleman right over from him. Everybody in the settlement knew this man. Robert Young was his name. Robert was 62 years old. And for you folks that don't know, Robert, he had named his rifle after his wife Mary. But he didn't call his rifle Mary, he called it Sweet Lips, because that's what he called Mary. I seen old Robert raise that rifle. I watched him take a careful aim. And I heard him say, "We'll see what Sweet Lips can do." And when he pulled that trigger, that got your attention, didn't it? Ferguson came right out of the saddle, but his foot was hung in the stirrup, and his horse spooked. You know, by the time he got his horse stopped, all the boys grabbed his horse and got it to stop. Ferguson had 8 more holes through him. He told his men when he got to Kings Mountain, he said, "God Almighty and all his angels won't take me off this mountain." He don't realize how right he was, because that's where we left him. Every man that was fighting with Ferguson that day was killed or captured. And they were 28 patriots that never seen the sun set. We camped at the bottom of that little mountain that night. And I got to tell you, to this day, I can hear the sounds of the wounded and the dying. We started marching the prisoners north the next day toward the Yadkin River. A few days later, we sent some boys marching them on, and the rest of us cut and headed back over the mountain. You know, it took about a week for old Cornwallis to find out we whipped Ferguson so bad. But when he found out, he kind of turned tail and ran like a scalded dog. He had no idea where this band of rabble, he called us, this over mountain army, was at. As a matter of fact, last we heard of Cornwallis, old Nathaniel Green, Dan Morgan was running him ragged all over the mountains, and he was headed back toward the coast. But us over mountain men, we went back over the mountain. We went back over there to raise our crops and to raise our families. But the most important seed we ever planted, we didn't realize it at the time, was that day on Kings Mountain. Because within an hour and 5 minutes, we planted a seed of freedom. Because what we did that day, if you think about it, it was nothing short of a miracle. Because there was a band of 900 starved, exhausted, hunters and farmers volunteered to the last man. We stopped and we forced the retreat of the most powerful army in the world, and then we went home. Now this story we just shared with you, we share with everybody. We program year-round, and every year, September the 25th, well, we actually start on the 23rd, sometimes even earlier. Sometimes we start way up in Virginia where the William Campbell's boys met, and we follow the trail all the way to Kings Mountain. We camp where they camped. We tell this story to everybody to listen. Sometimes it's thousands, sometimes it's 2. You may see some of us standing in the Walmart parking lot telling this story. But the year before they shut the world down with COVID, we told this story to 17,000 kids in 3 weeks. Our motto is keeping the story alive. This is one of the most untold stories in the whole American Revolution, because it wasn't the Continental Army that defeated Ferguson. It was a band of frontier militia. So we tell this story everywhere. I've had the privilege of standing in Yorktown where Cornwallis surrendered to British forces and telling these men's story. I've had the privilege of standing in Philadelphia and telling these men's story. We take it everywhere, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I invite you guys to keep up with us. You can find us online, OVTA.org, Facebook. You can come over here to our booth. We got brochures, memberships. If you got any questions, feel free to ask. If we don't know the answer, we'll make something up. Thank you, guys.